Welcome back to KCA Grammar, Unit 2, Week 3. I'm so excited about today's topic. We're learning about complex sentences, and it's going to be super fun. So get your papers and your pencils ready, and let's begin. Okay, so we're going to start by defining a complex sentence. A complex sentence is a sentence that contains one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So just to review, we're going to talk about what a clause is. It's basically a group of words or phrase. And an independent clause is going to be a clause with a subject and a verb that makes sense on its own. So an independent clause might be the blanket is striped. That's a sentence that has both a subject, blanket, and a verb, is, and it makes sense on its own. So it's an independent clause. And remember that an independent clause can stand alone and be its own simple sentence, while a dependent clause might be something like, while you were sleeping. This clause does not make sense on its own. It cannot stand alone as a simple sentence. You couldn't just say, while you were sleeping, period, or else your friends would be like, what? What happened? So this is a dependent clause. So basically, a complex sentence is when you have at least one independent clause, like this, and at least one dependent clause in the sentence together. While in the past, a simple sentence is just one independent clause, and a compound sentence is two independent clauses. Now we're joining it together with an independent clause and a dependent clause. So for example, a compound sentence might be, during the French and Indian War, many lost their lives. Let's dissect this and see why this is a complex sentence. Well, we take each clause by itself. Many lost their lives cannot stand alone as a simple sentence. Many lost their lives. That could be a sentence. During the French and Indian War, however, cannot be an independent clause. It can't stand alone. That means it must be a dependent clause. Thus, this as a sentence contains one independent clause and one dependent clause. That makes it a complex sentence, since our definition says it contains one independent clause and one dependent clause. Now this sentence says, because the Indians were furious, they joined the French. We can see again that this is a complex sentence. Let's dissect the clauses. This clause says, because the Indians were furious. Now, that can't stand alone. It's not an independent clause, so we know that we could label this as a dependent clause. While this clause, they joined the French, now that can stand alone. You could say, they joined the French. That could be a simple sentence and stand alone. Now, before we start our sentences, I think it's important to go through each type of sentence structure we've learned, since each one of them is very different, but they could be confused easily. So first we're going to look at the simple sentences. A simple sentence is one clause, one independent clause standing alone. So something like, she cried. A compound sentence is two independent clauses. So maybe, she cried and he cooked. Now we have our new sentence structure, complex, and that is one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So an example of that might be, while she cried, he cooked. So that's just a quick run through of exactly what we're looking at in sentence structures and what you should be looking for when you're trying to label them in your homework. Alright, so we're going to start with our first sentence. It says, when the first colonists arrived, they lived in huts. So we're going to start by looking at this very first word, when. And although it's at the beginning of the sentence, this is actually going to be a conjunction. It's a specific type of conjunction, though. This is called a subordinating conjunction. So, a subordinating conjunction is the type of conjunction that introduces a dependent clause. So, when is introducing the dependent clause of when the first colonists arrived. On the other hand, we've been looking at coordinating conjunctions, which are normally seen in our compound sentences. So this first word, when, is going to be a conjunction. That's because it's going to be joining this dependent clause with the independent clause. Sometimes to see this, we have to reorganize the sentence. So you might want to say in your head, they lived in huts when the first colonists arrived. And in that way you can see exactly how this when acts as a conjunction, even though it's at the beginning of the sentence. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it makes sense. So you might have to reorganize it. So the dependent clause says when the first colonist arrives, and this is going to be an article adjective. Colonist is going to be a subject noun, and arrived is our verb intransitive. Now first is going to be a word that is modifying colonists, so that's an adjective. They lived in huts. We're just going to label this as we would a regular independent clause. They is our subject pronoun, taking the place of the word colonists. Lived is going to be a verb, intransitive, and this is a prepositional phrase. So that's a preposition, and then huts is our object of the preposition. So I'm going to show you how to diagram this. It's actually not going to be too different from the way we diagram a compound sentence. We're actually going to begin, though, by figuring out which of these clauses is the independent and which one is the dependent. So you just have to read it to yourself. When the first colonists arrived, they lived in huts. The one that can stand alone is this clause. They lived in huts. So actually, that one's going to go on top. So we're going to diagram that first. They lived and in huts. Now, we always put the dependent clause beneath. And that's because the dependent clause is the one that's being connected by this subordinating conjunction. So we're just going to diagram this as normal. Colonist is a subject, arrived is the verb. Be is an article adjective, and it is modifying colonists. And first is also modifying colonists. Now, the way that we're going to connect these two sentences is through a little dotted line like so, a slanted line, and our subordinating conjunction is going to go here. So you see it's not too different from the way that we diagram compound sentences. The difference is just going to be that you always want to make sure your dependent clause is the one on the bottom, because that's the one that's going to be joined by this conjunction. And this conjunction is always going to be joined slanted with the dotted line from the top independent clause to the bottom dependent clause. So this is obviously a complex sentence, and it's a declarative sentence since it's making a statement. Alright, so we're going to do some more because this is just going to take a little bit of practice and getting used to. Alright, so our second sentence says, New York was planted and New Jersey was divided. So the first thing you want to do with a sentence like this is check and see what the sentence structure is. So we're going to check and see what our clauses look like. New York was planted and New Jersey was divided. So this is actually going to be a compound sentence because look, that is an independent clause and this is an independent clause. They can both stand alone. And we know that the definition of a compound sentence is two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. So to diagram this, we're going to start out by labeling our sentence, and New York is going to be a subject noun. Our verb in this is going to be planted, a verb intransitive, and was is of course going to be our helping verb, helping give context to the sentence. Now we know that and is a coordinating conjunction. For the second half of the sentence, New Jersey is a subject noun, divided, verb intransitive, was is a helping verb. So they're pretty similar. Now we're just going to diagram it. Subject noun is New York. And then our verb phrase here was planted. Then our second independent clause, the subject is New Jersey. And the verb phrase is was divided. Now we know that we connect these like this with our coordinating conjunction. Alright, New York was planted and New Jersey was divided. So we know that this is a compound sentence and that this is a declarative sentence. Alright, so our third sentence says, she was throwing a ball while he was sprinting. Now the first thing you want to do is figure out what type of sentence structure this is. So our first clause says she was throwing a ball, and our second clause says while he was sprinting. And it's clear that she was throwing a ball is going to be an independent clause because this can stand alone. While on the other hand, while he was sprinting, this is a dependent clause. You can't say while he was sprinting by itself. So thus this is going to be a complex sentence. Our subject is going to be she, which is a subject pronoun. And then our verb is going to be throwing. What was she throwing? A ball, so it's going to be a transitive verb. Then we know that ball is going to be our direct object. So next is was, which is a helping verb. It's helping make sense of a sentence. And of course, a is an article adjective. While is going to be our conjunction. And then the dependent clause, he is a subject pronoun, and was sprinting is our verb phrase, sprinting is a verb intransitive, and was is our helping verb. Alright, so now we're just going to diagram our sentence, and we're going to start by identifying which one's an independent clause and which one's a dependent, because we know that the dependent clause has to go on the bottom. So we remember that while he was sprinting is going to be our dependent clause because that cannot stand alone as a simple sentence. So we're going to start by diagramming the first independent clause with our subject pronoun she. Our verb phrase was throwing. Ball, the direct object. She was throwing a ball. And then the dependent clause is he was sprinting. Remember, we connect these just like this. So this is going to be a complex sentence, and it's a declarative sentence. I'm going to pause here and say that sometimes it can be confusing at first to distinguish a compound sentence from a complex sentence. And one thing that might hint you in the right direction is to know that the subordinating conjunctions, it's helpful to be able to distinguish them easily. And if there's a subordinating conjunction, then you know it's going to be, most likely it's going to be a complex sentence. So some examples of these are after, while, because, since, if, and when. So generally, if you see this, a little thing should go off in your head saying, oh, this is probably a complex sentence, and you should search for your dependent clause, because these subordinating conjunctions are often used in a complex sentence. You might want to just write a couple of these down so that you can remember them. All right, so our next sentence says, when the colonists arrived, winter had arrived. So something should go off in your head with this word right here, because we know that's going to be our subordinating conjunction. And we can see then that this is going to be a complex sentence, since this is a dependent clause. And when there's a dependent clause with an independent clause, then it's a complex sentence. So our first clause is dependent and our second is independent. Of the first clause, our subject is going to be colonists. They're the one doing the action. And arrived is going to be our verb intransitive. And the is an article adjective. In our second independent clause, winter is actually our subject noun. That's doing the action here. And arrived is a verb intransitive, while had is going to be our helping verb. All right, so what you need to remember about a complex sentence is the independent clause always goes on the top, the dependent one goes on the bottom. So again, you might want to reorganize this in your head. Winter had arrived when the colonists arrived. So winter is our subject noun of the independent clause. And had arrived is our verb phrase. So we're just going to diagram that like that. And our subject of the dependent is colonists. And an article adjective modifying colonists. We're just going to connect this with our subordinating conjunction right here. And of course this is going to be a complex sentence, and it's going to be a declarative sentence. Okay, so just a couple things to keep in mind, because this lesson is a little bit trickier and it's a lot to take in. The most important thing when you're trying to distinguish a complex sentence from a compound sentence is knowing the difference between your independent and dependent clauses. So I would honestly start by, in each sentence you get, labeling if it's an independent clause or if it's a dependent clause. And a little cue to know if it's dependent is when there's a subordinating conjunction, which you guys should have written down. So when you're beginning to label and diagram a sentence, just always distinguish, maybe in your head, or if it's helpful to do it on paper, just distinguish which one is the dependent clause and which one's the independent clause. And if there's no dependent clause at all, and it's just two independent clauses, then you know it's going to be a compound sentence. But if you see a dependent clause that cannot stand alone and doesn't make sense by itself, then you know that it's going to be a complex sentence when it's paired with an independent clause. You guys got this. It's going to get easier. You just have to keep practicing. Have a good week.